Good afternoon. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We're delighted that you could join us, what I think is going to be a fascinating and very important conversation about understanding and combating anti-terrorism in Europe today. We have three excellent panelists who will help us understand as well as shed some light on these dynamics, and I think particularly set against the backdrop of this extraordinary migration crisis that is unfolding in Europe. I think this will be very insightful indeed. So let me begin by introducing Mr. Gilles Clavreau, the French interministerial delegate for the fight against racism and anti-Semitism. Gilles oversees the delegation's efforts and focuses on policies dealing with the fight against racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. He works directly under Prime Minister Manuel Valls and was very instrumental in drafting the new action plan for France in April of 2015. Prior to his work as the interministerial delegate, Gilles served as an advisor for domestic affairs from 2012 to 2014. Then we'll turn to Rabbi Andy Baker, who is the personal representative of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's chairperson in office on combating anti-Semitism. Andy also serves as the director of international Jewish affairs at the American Jewish Committee. He has worked tirelessly for many years, and that's where I first met Andy, working particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, promoting tolerance and focusing on how to focus on restoration as well as the legacy dealing with the Holocaust. And we're delighted, Andy, that you could be with us. And finally, someone who I wanted to bring to CSIS for a long time, Mr. Jeffrey Goldberg, national correspondent for The Atlantic. Jeff also serves as a columnist for Bloomberg View and has worked extensively as a Middle East and Washington correspondent for The New Yorker and as a contributing editor at the New York Times. I think many of you may have read Jeff's April column article in The Atlantic, Is It Time for the Jews to Leave Europe?, which sparked a very important conversation, and we look forward to Jeff's reflections as well. So after the three panelists conclude their remarks, I'll moderate some question and answers. I know many in our audience have some questions as well, and we look forward to a great conversation and dialogue. And with that, again, welcome, Gilles. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Heather. I'm very pleased and honored to be in front of you today. I'm almost starting my 7-day visit to the U.S. After having hosted lots of American delegations in Paris, but also delegations coming from other European countries, trying to assess and to some extent not only to assess but also to give some support and show of interest to what is going on in our country, in France, but what tends to become more and more obvious these days, I think, is that what we experience in France since some years, if I maybe put it like that to be clear, since the beginning of the year 2000, is now a European issue, and it has some global impact, especially when it comes to dealing with Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. Previously, as you said, either I was by the President's office, and I've left this very thrilling position a couple of months ago, some months ago, because we had in front of us this terrible situation of rising hatred, rising anti-Semitism, rising number of anti-Jew acts, but also speeches, reactions of hatred against the Muslims, and by and large, reactions of hate, of willing to divide the national community, to aggress and to harm the others, something which is totally and absolutely the opposite of not only the Republican values, as I put it this way to describe a French singular model, but the universal values of liberty, of freedom, of tolerance, freedom of speech that we share and that we share on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. If I mention this to recall it, is because it's often said rightfully that we have so many differences in the situations we are faced with in America and in France and Europe, but it's very important to me to recall that we also have fundamentally the same values. So what was the context I was talking about? That rise of violence, of hatred, and not only from far right, this is, I always put it like that, classical, but also from other parts of the society, the ideology of fundamentalism, far left extremism, and some new political and ideological chimeras appearing as the too much famous Dieudonné or the too much famous Soral creators coming from show business or from far left and moving to far right. It was no longer acceptable nor possible to have continuous growth of anti-Semitic acts from year to year. Last year, they have doubled, and it was 10 times as much as what it was usually before the year 2000, meaning close to 1,000 acts a year. It was not possible to see and to hear, and Jeffrey would be sensitive to that, I think, to hear rising voices in the Jewish community, should we live, is still our place in France. And it was no longer acceptable to hear the Muslims say, when will we be French once and for real? When will we be considered as fully French citizens? So that's why I wanted to be in that position, to build a plan that the Prime Minister and the President of the Republic called for, and it was a few days before the attacks of January. And ever since, every day we have tried to build it, and now we try to implement it, and we want to mobilize all the categories of the French population, all the members of the civil society, far beyond elites, public leaders, but also local leaders, but also religious leaders, cultural elites and figures. And I hope we are on the good way. I think we are on the good way, but definitely we have a hell of a job to do. This will take time. It goes far beyond a technocratic action plan. We have a whole generation to put back on tracks on what Republican and democratic values are, in addition to the terrorist risk. Thank you.
Thank you. Andy?
Well, just a couple of points of context here, because I think if you go back certainly 15 years ago, maybe even a little less, we didn't see a problem. Jews in Western Europe thought, for the most part, anti-Semitism was receding into history. And it took a while, I think, before it was recognized that something had changed. We saw it manifest in different ways, finally governments recognizing this within the context of the OSCE, an important conference in Berlin, a declaration that could say anti-Semitism has taken on new forms and manifestations, that could say events in the Middle East and Israel can never justify anti-Semitism. Again, at a time when you had a real surge in anti-Semitic incidents that in some cases government officials, including those in Paris, were sort of dismissing as not really being anti-Semitism, as somehow being manifestations of anger at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some of that's still there, but now clearly governments have recognized there's a very real problem. And yet even here, what maybe has brought this recognition has come with the lethal attacks, what we've seen in Brussels, in Paris, and in Copenhagen. It certainly forced governments to wake up But it wasn't all that long ago that I think even there was a sense that the problem and the anxieties that Jews were feeling, and it was there before these most recent attacks, were somehow falling under the radar screen, at least with the political leadership. As I pointed out in other places, when I was almost exactly a year ago in Copenhagen and discussed the concerns that that Jewish community, which had experienced incidents of anti-Semitism during the summer, and they were asking for police guards in front of the synagogue, in front of the Jewish school, when kids were going, when people were going to services, government officials said to me, well, here in Denmark, we have a relaxed approach to security. We're concerned that Danish citizens would feel uncomfortable if they saw armed guards in front of these places. So, in fact, we're not going to provide them. 2 years ago, when I was in Paris, this was before Gilles was appointed to this position, and in the Interior Ministry, you would say, well, what's the source of this significant and growing number of anti-Semitic incidents? And officials could say with some precision, these are the number of incidents that come from left-wing anti-Semitic sources, this from right-wing and neo-Nazi. But the vast number were coming from parts of the Muslim community. There's no term for that at that point. They couldn't say Muslim. You don't identify in France by religion or ethnicity. They said, but we have a term we're using, intercommunal tension. As though somehow this is Jews against Muslims, Muslims against Jews. I said to one official, well, if you were dealing with battered women, you wouldn't call it intergender tension. But you really had, and this added to the anxiety that the Jews in France felt, as somehow this is a problem of two minorities. They're outside France as a whole. And I don't wish to single out France. In Sweden, you have very good documentation of hate crimes, officials funded by the government operating independently that review all of them, that have a very clear picture each year of anti-Semitic incidents. But when I pressed in Stockholm, can you say more about the perpetrators of these incidents? I was told, well, yes, we can, but the government has to ask us. And the government wasn't asking. There it's not by law, but I would say there was a kind of political correctness. We don't want to look too closely, too carefully, because what really had changed was essentially with the growth of a Muslim population in Europe, and this is certainly not to blame or to cast aspersions on all Muslims, but the vast majority of incidents that were occurring, new incidents in any case, were coming from this particular community. It requires a lot, and I think this is the action plan that the French government has laid out that addresses some of this. If it works, I think it's too early to know, but it requires a lot, but at the very least it requires recognizing that there are specific sources, and if you're going to deal with the problem, you have to get at those sources. So you have that, and let's also admit you have a strong anti-Israel animus in much of Western Europe. And at a certain point, that crosses over to be a form of anti-Semitism. I mean, when Israel is demonized, when it's declared a racist state, and so on. And Jews in Europe are conflated with Israel. Put aside the complications if European Jews want to give public expression to their feelings and support for Israel, how awkward and difficult that can be. And in fact, one demonstration that was organized last summer in Denmark by different Jewish groups was 5 minutes after it started essentially shut down by the police because they said we really can't provide the physical protection. So you have that, but again, you have this sense that you're defending, whatever your own view is, you're defending the views of Israel in a society that's significantly, in various of these countries, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, and that also adds a different dimension. Finally, when the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights did a comprehensive survey of Jews' perceptions and experiences in 8 EU countries, it was conducted in 2012. It was before the horrific attacks last January, but even in that survey, 46% of the French Jewish community said they were considering emigrating because of this concern about anti-Semitism. No doubt that number has increased, not decreased since then. It wasn't unique. You had significantly high numbers in Belgium. By the way, you had an even higher number in Hungary. And even if you factor out the sort of genetic pessimism that is part of Hungarian and Hungarian Jewry, it's still a significant number. And it also reflects the fact that we're not just talking throughout Europe about concerns from Muslim communities or concerns about an anti-Israel animus, but clearly in the European environment, right-wing, xenophobic, populist parties are in the ascendancy. And they may not be targeting Jews in the first breath that's issued, but anti-Semitism is certainly the thread that connects a lot of these parties. And of course, in a place like Hungary, the Jobbik party is quite openly anti-Semitic. So you're facing a variety, I think, of these problems depending on where you look in Europe today.
Andy, thank you so much. Jeff.
Thank you. So you want genetic pessimism? I'll give you. Uh-oh. I got genetic pessimism for you. No, I don't have that much to add to my two co-panelists here. I would just say that, just to sort of frame this out the way I'm thinking about this problem and have been thinking about this problem. Everyone wants a solution to these problems in each of these countries. There is not much hope for the future of European Jewry, and we have to face that. And that, and I say that taking into account both the resurgence of anti-Semitism, but even if there hadn't been this resurgence of anti-Semitism, the Jewish communities of Europe are in a slow and inexorable demographic decline. And I start and here we're going to go full pessimism. I start by acknowledging something that's very difficult in the Jewish world to acknowledge and very difficult in Europe to acknowledge, which is that Hitler won. Hitler won at least part of his war. Part of his core mission was to destroy world Jewry. He managed to destroy European Jewry almost in whole. And there is no recovery from what he did. And one of the obvious proofs of that is that the center of Jewish life, which for 1,000 years was Europe, radically shifted after 1945 to what became Israel and North America. Today, these two communities, Israel and North America, comprise 80–85% of world Jewry. So what is happening in Europe is, in many ways, epilogue. One proof of that, of course, is that in the largest portion of the largest Jewish community in Europe, that being the French Jewish community, is not actually European. 3/4 of French Jews are actually from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, or descendants of people from Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. That's one of the reasons that they're highly mobile, and so many of them have connections to family in Israel already. So now that I've framed it in the darkest way possible, I would want to note some bright spots. And one of the problems in these kind of dialogues, not this one, which is a high level and obviously sophisticated, but in other dialogues I've been in, is that there is this rush on the part of some Jewish organizations, and definitely not the American Jewish community, I should say, but some Jewish organizations, to equate what's going on right now with what happened, sort of the period of the 1930s, to say that 2015 resembles 1938. It does not for any number of reasons. First and foremost is that there is an Israel where people can go to. If, obviously, refugees from Syria had another Syria and Israel to go to, we wouldn't be facing the issue that you're seeing right now. But there is an Israel, and there is a powerful American Jewish community that is there to advocate for those communities that remain in Europe. That's one. The second, just as important, I think, is and here's the almost perfectly poetic example of why today is not 1938. In 1938, in the 30s, obviously, the leader of Germany was the foremost proponent of the extermination of the Jews, the removal of Jews from the planet. Today, the Chancellor of Germany is one of the most important voices against anti-Semitism. And I would say, and I will go out of my way to say this, that in France, you have particularly the Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, has gone far, way above what the minimum necessary in terms of the defense of the Jews. Not only defense of Jewish property and Jewish life, but defending the very idea that the soul of France depends on the country's ability to be a friendly place, to be a hospitable place for a large Jewish community. And so you have leadership almost across the, I wouldn't say across the board, because Scandinavia, Belgium, places like that are slightly different. But in the UK and Germany and France, you have leaders who are committed to the struggle against anti-Semitism. That said, I'm not sure the struggle is winnable in the sense that the problems that are causing this resurgence of anti-Semitism are only growing more treacherous. And let me just end with this, and we talk about, I hope we can talk about the refugee issue as sort of a latest manifestation of this. The problem of Islamism in European Muslim communities is not receding. The Middle East, or large chunks of the Middle East, are disintegrating and causing the sort of terrorism that we see obviously predominantly in Iraq and Syria to emanate outward. There is no solution to that problem, and God forbid you should say this, but I can't imagine that the attacks of last January mark the last time that Jewish institutions will be attacked, successfully or unsuccessfully, in France or other places. So you have that as a situation. You have another point, which, and I guess when I echo what Andy said, Muslim extremist anti-Semitism in Europe, which is where the physical threat to Jewish life and property resides at the moment. It would flourish completely independent of any other phenomenon, but in the current European climate, in which anti-Zionism has become de rigueur, and which anti-Zionism quickly bleeds over into forms of anti-Semitism. There is a growing tolerance, and again, Manuel Valls and David Cameron and others are exceptions to this. They've been very frank about talking about anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism, but in the main, the seedbed for anti-Semitism is there in broader society. On the left, obviously, we see a self-described friend of Hamas and Hezbollah just taking over the Labour Party in Britain in the past few days. So you have a very fertile seedbed for the kind of anti-Semitism that encourages those with actual violent impulses to act out on their violent impulses. I don't see anything solving that problem. Obviously, one should be grateful for the efforts of the French government in particular to put soldiers and paratroopers in front of Jewish institutions, in front of synagogues. But I would say, on the flip side, that you're not living in a normal situation in a normal place when, in order to go to synagogue, you need 20 or 30 French paratroopers to protect you. And that is not, if the government is willing to fund it, it might be a long-term solution, but it does not actually solve the problem that's at the heart of this.
Jeff, thank you. Goodness, rich areas to explore here. Let me begin. I want to share a statistic that I read. The Rabbinical Center of Europe had conducted a survey, and they said 70% of those European Jews surveyed avoided revealing their faiths, no outward sign. 85% said they were afraid to take their children to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, for again, the physical security. And although it was not much noted in the news, on September the 10th, 2 elderly Holocaust survivors in the Netherlands were brutally beaten and robbed, and with a terrible epitaph said as they were being beaten. It's palatable. It's there. And I think the frustration is, what can governments do? We certainly, Jeffrey had a very pessimistic view. How can society be held account for that? What are the actions that we need? Raising it, leaders obviously suggest that this is not the right way. How do you go about changing it? Is there a government policy, a formula to change behavior? So that's my first question. And secondly, let's talk about the migration crisis. Clearly, this will exacerbate so much within the Muslim community, potentially, creating that where anti-Zionism turns into anti-Semitism. I'd welcome from all three panelists thoughts on how increasing, could be up to hundreds of thousands of Muslims entering Europe. How will that change this issue? Will it send a strong message that Jews must leave, or can solutions be found? And Gilles, you want to? Those are easy questions to answer.
Yeah, definitely. We have easy talks with easy questions, easy problems. Yeah, I agree. 99% on the analysis of Jeffrey on the situation. I'm not as pessimistic as he is on what is forthcoming. Otherwise, I would have resigned for weeks. No, seriously, I'm not, because I would be very pessimistic if we have done lots of things to combat in the previous months and years, in the previous years of this rising situation. But we have done so little, actually. We have done so little in terms of speaking clearly. This has been pinpointed, and that's very important. What are we talking about? Who is responsible for giving ground to such speeches as evil comes from Israel and everything that goes behind on political hidden agendas we all know. We have done so little on education. What happens when in a classroom the teacher can't talk about Shoah? What happens next? It might happen. It happens in everyday life. But okay, that's not big drama if we have solutions behind, either in terms of sanction and in terms of taking the time with appropriate tools to explain the kids why this is grave and why understanding what Shoah was is important and has something to do even with their own personal situation and fate. We've done so little to regulate the internet, and this is not only a French nor a European matter, it's a global matter. Look at what you find everywhere, every time, against anyone, not only the Jews, but anyone dealing with religion or beliefs or whatsoever. What have we done on all these fields? Even the judicial system has to be completely reshaped, and the response, the chain of response, has to be put in order to sanction effectively the authors of hate speech, of violence against the Jews. All these fields, areas, have to be investigated and taken in hand by public powers, by civil society representatives. I mean, we have so much to do that hasn't been done before. If we don't succeed in doing a little better and improving a little better in these various fields, hence it will be true, very difficult to progress. But as of now, we have some reasons to say to the French Jews, your place is here, your place is in France, and as Manuel Valls repeated and said very often in front of the Jewish community, it's not only a matter of the Jews, it's a matter of France. Why? Because the Jews in France are not here since the trauma of the Second World War, not even since the pogroms of the late 19th century, not even since the full citizenship acknowledged to the Jews in 1791, but for 2,000 years, since the beginning of the Christian era. So the Jews in France are part of our history. If we cut off one member of our body, the body dies. That's the point. And what makes me think that we have still lots of things to do and to improve is that in the public debate, we haven't been comfortable with these forms of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism coming from the left, coming from the Muslims. Why? Because we are facing new and very, very perverse enemies. utilizing some liberties, some freedoms, some rights to fight against the liberty. Just as the far right in France now uses to its political benefit the words of the Republican values, like defending secularism, like defending freedom of speech against democracy. And on both sides of this political spectrum, we have instrumentalizing some freedoms against freedom. That's the key of what we have to fight against. As long as we haven't tried, let's not say we have lost. That's it.
Gilles, before I turn, do you want to just mention on what has been the dynamic within France on the migration crisis, and have you noticed a change in reflection in your work now that as the crisis continues to unfold?
Not so much, actually. Not so much, and probably not as much as in other European countries, because the level of noise upon all xenophobic issues was so high, then it couldn't be any higher. But that's the dark face of it. In fact, the migrant issue is a daily issue for us for more than 2 years. We've been trying hard, discreetly but firmly, to develop a European common approach, and if not to say a global approach with our American allies too. It's not too late, but it's a bit late, but it's here. Now we know there can't be nothing else but a common solution. It's impossible to have national egoist politics on that issue. It's impossible. So with Germany, especially with other European partners, we are building up this approach because there can't be nothing but a common solution.
And you just mentioned, the clarity of speaking out. Who is responsible? The education, which I know you've been very involved in, OSCE, sanctions perhaps, greater public debate. What is the OSCE and your capacity as personal representative? What are they doing about these challenges?
Well, if I could,
please,
even before I get there, just because, of course, it's very provocative to say, is there a future for Jews in Europe? And the fact is, I don't know how you can really predict. There are clearly serious problems. Though I think back, if you were in, as I was for the first time a little more than 30 years ago in Germany, you might have said there really isn't much of a future for Jewish life in Germany. 25, 30,000 people maybe, demographically questionable. Who would have imagined the changes that took place? And now we see a Jewish community in Germany numbering 100, 120, 130,000 people. Admittedly, they're not German. But their children will be German. I mean, they come from the former Soviet Union. And for that matter, that German Jewish community 30 years ago didn't start out as German either. Most of them were Eastern European Jews who, at the end of the war, simply stayed there. So I don't know. It's hard to predict. I think most of the Jews in Europe today would like to stay in Europe, but it's obviously an open question as to what that environment will be. Ironically, I think if you look at the traditional types of attitude surveys, some that we used to do and others do, questions about how you feel regarding Jews as your neighbor, what kind of image they project in society, and so on, you see pretty much of a constant, progressive, more positive trend throughout Western Europe. So it's not the general attitude toward Jews by the society as a whole that is causing the anxiety. Clearly, it has to do with that anti-Israel animus, which is a significant burden that these people feel. And again, in large measure, incidents coming out of the Muslim populations in Europe. So, if peace were to break out in the Middle East, if Europe could somehow figure out how to deal with assimilating this Muslim population, I would say the world would be very different for European Jews. But I think it's very hard to imagine either of those issues resolving themselves positively or optimistically anytime soon, if at all. So that burden is there. When you cite the statistics in this latest survey, I have my doubts as to the quality of such a survey, but no doubt there are significant numbers of people who are concerned, and particularly those that are identifiably Jewish, simply walking in the street. The irony today is, if you're an Orthodox Jew and you dress as an Orthodox Jew, you'll feel much more comfortable on the streets of Moscow than you will in the streets of Brussels or Paris. I don't know who would have imagined that some time back, but that's the reality today. So that is a dilemma, I think, for observant Jews or for people who would naturally and simply want to identify as such. They're very cautious about that. And I don't think that can sort of go on indefinitely and one still have a good and positive sense of a Jewish self in that kind of life. Within the OSCE, I think it has been the one arena. It's a cumbersome organization because it works by consensus. And if you think 57 governments agreeing on anything, it's a challenge. But at least it has addressed the issue of anti-Semitism. It was the first international organization to organize a conference focused only on the subject of anti-Semitism. That's back in 2003 in Vienna, followed a year later by that high-level conference in Berlin, and creating various, now a whole department within its Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. It's developing educational materials. It's pressing governments, at least providing assistance, to monitor hate crimes. Keep in mind, I think when the EUMC did its first study of anti-Semitism in the EU in 2004, when you had 17 member states, half of them, they had monitors, half of them didn't even have a definition of anti-Semitism. Most of those countries weren't identifying hate crimes of any sort. So this has been a long process even to be able to get governments to recognize such a thing exists and then to look more specifically at, okay, which of those are anti-Semitic and what then could or should be done about it. Again, it works by consensus. It can try to hold up best practices. I think the discussions that have gone on sometimes get waylaid by the consensus process and the bureaucracy, but they haven't really turned into a sort of perversion or parody of the discussion, which we've seen, frankly, at the United Nations. So, in that sense, I think the OSCE can be held up in some measure. With my role, and I was appointed in 2009 and reappointed each year, it does give me the opportunity to take these issues up in capitals and issue a report and issue recommendations that mostly governments will ignore. But sometimes they'll take note. And ironically, it was easy for me to recommend in Denmark, in that report, after a visit, you should put police in front of synagogues and schools. And at least giving credit to the Scandinavians, they take these international organizations a lot more seriously than we do in this country. So the fact that it was a recommendation that the government never acted on became a real political issue and something that the justice minister in Denmark had to confront the parliament essentially to answer. So maybe that was one good example. And now just to comment about migrants in Europe. Problems, but maybe opportunities. Look, you cannot, I would say you cannot be Jewish and look at what has gone on and not feel for these people who have come in such numbers to find refuge. I mean, I just don't know. Whatever problems may come with it, it seems to me you have to state that full stop. You have to feel some identity, some empathy, some association. Jews in Europe know what it's like to be refugees. They know what it's like when doors are closed. Again, if we're saying so much of the problem is coming from the Muslim communities in Europe, you might say if those communities simply get larger, doesn't that mean more problems? Maybe, but maybe not. I mean, I think most Western European countries have had a very laissez-faire attitude in terms of migrants. They make their way, they find their place, but there's no real proactive integration process. And maybe now with such numbers, at least in Germany, there's also the consideration that you're going to have to do something extensively, and let's make bringing them into some understanding of European values, some appreciation of pluralism or diversity part of that process. Admittedly, it's going to be hard, but I think maybe that's the possible positive thing. Obviously, you can also look at this and say it's going to embolden right-wing and populist parties. I mean, starting with our, our friends in Hungary, and even before the numbers came through, you already had a Hungarian prime minister that was playing on this politically. So I don't know. I know Jeff knows National Front very well in France. It's hard not to think that this is also going to bolster these parties in Western Europe.
Yeah, and Jeff, in addition to the questions, let's talk and add to your plate. Let's talk about political parties and how they use anti-Semitism as a recruitment tool, as a tool of populism, xenophobia. You've interviewed Marine Le Pen. We would love your insights, but also want to hear on the migration crisis and the other questions.
Yeah. Well, on the migration, I mean, it's all one big.
Yeah, it's true. One big thing.
It's one big thing. The migration. Let me start with something that Andy said. That the anti-Semitism that you see evinced in corners of the European Muslim community, not representative of a general attitude in Europe toward anti-Semitism. I think that's true. Unfortunately, we live in the age of the super-empowered individual, and you need 0.5% of a Muslim community in order to change the security dynamic and ultimately the demographic dynamic of Jewish communities around Europe. And that holds true for this migration issue. I mean, you see European intelligence agencies thinking about this in ways that maybe aren't popular at the moment in a moment of huge sympathy for immigrants and migrants and refugees. But let's assume that 99.4% of everybody coming out of Syria, let's say, is simply a refugee looking for a better place. That's fine. And that probably is true. Nevertheless, Europe might be inadvertently importing people who 2 or 3 years from now, they're ticking bombs and they will go off, just as the returnees from the ISIS front are bombs that go off. And the point about the Jewish community, and there's a lot of points to make, but the point about the Jewish community is that I don't want to predict what incident actually sets off a large-scale exodus from France, but I don't know how many more incidents were away from a moment when not the Ashkenazi French Jews of central Paris, but the mass of Sephardim who live in the area, the ringing Paris, in the banlieue, in the suburbs, or in Toulouse or Marseille, where they simply say, you know what, we can't once every 6 months or once every year of an attack. It's too much. When there are alternatives. So again, are we witnessing and adding on to the problem? Maybe. Is there any moral choice? No, not really. I mean, again, from the Jewish perspective, certainly you can't close the door. It's not what you do. Obviously, this migrant crisis, I mean, it needs to be pointed out. The migrant crisis is a byproduct of, first and foremost, the viciousness of Assad and his sponsors in Russia and Iran, and it's also the byproduct of the Western inability to actually deal with the Syria crisis in Syria. I mean, the answer to the refugee crisis is obviously in Syria. It's not in Europe. It's not in the Mediterranean. It's not here either. And there's only one way to deal with that, but it's not something that the West has the will to deal with right now. On the question of the politics and how it's going to exacerbate the politics, look. One of the most disturbing things that I've come across in researching this issue over the last little while are Jews in Toulouse, in Créteil, in Sarcelles, in places around Paris, Jews who are thinking about voting for the National Front in the next election, which is historically anomalous. Let's just call it that. It's, but what they say is that Marine Le Pen is the only person who's actually speaking plainly about the issue that confronts us. They feel so isolated, so besieged, and they hear her speaking plainly in ways that they don't hear, let's say, more mainstream politicians speaking. Of course, what I would say to people I know well is, the National Front, once it deals with its Muslim problem, will come back to its traditional problem I'm sure. It's in the DNA of the party that it's not all of a sudden a philo-Semitic party. But Marine Le Pen is doing a very good job, and there are other right-wingers around Europe, extreme right-wingers, who are doing a good job of convincing people that they are philo-Semitic and anti-Muslim. There's ironies inside ironies here, and obviously there are many Muslim leaders who should understand that the Jews are natural allies in their common struggle against far-right extremism, but that's not manifesting itself so clearly. So obviously what's happening is, in the case of the National Front, they have tamped down the traditional sort of anti-Semitic rhetoric and narrative. I don't think, for what it's worth, that Marine Le Pen has the same obsessions that her father has about Jews. I think he has Jews on the brain. I think she might have Muslims on the brain. But it's, intolerance is baked into the party, and obviously further influx of seemingly unassimilated Muslims or Muslims who seem to be hard to assimilate is only going to help the problem. I mean, assuming, and I'm being pessimistic, assuming that there is no education panacea in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years that somehow convinces people predisposed to extremism not to be extremist anymore. I don't see that. So I think when you take in as many refugees as you can because that's the right thing to do, but I think that this is exacerbating some pre-existing conditions.
Let me ask the panelists one final question, then I want to turn this over to the audience. I want to give you a hypothetical, and I know there's dangers in a hypothetical scenario, but here it is. So a Hungarian election in the future produces a government that includes Jobbik, either by itself, it's the second largest party in Hungary, but it could come by itself, or together with Fidesz. What would the reaction be from Paris, from the OSCE, from the US, should that happen? It could happen in another European capital, but when a party, publicly avowed anti-Semitic party represents, as a government, a NATO and EU country, what do we do? Jews. And it's hypothetical.
Yeah, but what is not, it's the present situation. Let's not wait for this scenario to happen, to be very clear on what we expect from our, as of now, European partners in terms of respecting common law and respecting the principles of democracy. That's the first response I would give to that. Hence, what would happen in such a scenario? Once again, we have European rules in common. And all the European governments have to abide by these rules. So let's see. But of course, we would be very, very careful, very vigilant in such a situation. But as we are already.
Andy, you've spent some time in Budapest. You've dealt with the Hungarian government. What would you say?
Well, there's a precedent, and the precedent, I think, is when you had an Austrian government formed with Jörg Haider in the coalition, and you at the time had, by the way, there was a massive public demonstration in Austria against this, at least in terms of giving public expression. I happen to have been there, but Jewish community leaders spoke. I'm sure you'll have outspoken similar events. But in the end, I think the EU didn't know how to deal with this. I mean, it adopted a policy, a kind of not shaking hands or not participating alongside. It didn't really work. I mean, already I think there are things that the present government in Hungary has done and has said that have given pause in Brussels, but the EU itself, and now that it's 28, it makes it much more difficult because it also operates in a kind of consensus manner. It doesn't really have a way of censoring or expelling members once they're in. I mean, I would hope, depending on what any government does anywhere, we'd have strong voices, certainly in civil society, and it'd be nice to think also here in this capital that would speak out. but it doesn't always happen.
I have to say, before I turn this over to Jeff, I think as an editorial comment, I think many in the EU saw the experience in 2000 as such a disaster, they don't ever want to approach it again. But that's my own editorial comment, Jeffrey.
Well, I mean, as a narrow matter of the Jewish community in Hungary, which is 80,000 or so, I guess, I was going to say that what I would like to see happen is the world Jewish community encourage those Hungarian Jews to immediately leave, but I would encourage them to do that now, in fact. It doesn't seem like a very hopeful place for a Jewish community, but that's just my opinion based on a couple of visits and talking to people there. You know, the reaction in this capital, one would hope, and this is interesting because it would set up a confrontation, I think, between the U.S. and Israel on this, but I would hope that Congress and whatever administration is in power would say, you know, we're not going to make the same mistakes of the 30s, and we're going to be very generous toward Hungarian Jews who need to flee that country and get out before the going gets really bad. The confrontation that sets with Israel, and this is an interesting, it's an interesting parenthetical. I've talked about this hypothetically with a lot of Jewish leaders, and you know, there's going to come a moment. Or there may come a moment in Scandinavia, let's say, where a Jewish person presents himself to the U.S. embassy in whatever capital and says, I need political refugee status because this country is too dangerous for me. Interestingly, it sets up a ideological confrontation between Israel and the U.S. because Israel, of course, believes itself to be, and this is a core ideology of Israel, as the answer to Jewish refugee problems. But I would hope that this country would be generous in that regard, and obviously Israel is institutionally or legally bound. But you know, it's interesting. One point just to loop back to sort of the moment that we're in. In many ways, the moment that we're in terms of in terms of the safety of these Jewish communities, is we've returned to a kind of medieval model of in the relationship between Jewish communities and the leaders. And this goes to the question you raised, which I didn't answer, about where's the public, where's the general public. In France, it's fascinating. You have in medieval times, you had good times for Jews and bad times for Jews, and those were entirely dependent on what the local prince or what the local king thought of the Jews. Some princes, some kings would protect their Jews, and then the Jews would be okay from the mob. And that you could say is France in some ways. I don't want to overgeneralize, but you know that's a French model where you have a very benevolent government that's very concerned about the Jewish community, and where there's mainly indifference on the part of the public. In Hungary, the situation you're describing, and even the situation marginally today, you're describing a situation in which the prince, the local ruler, is not that friendly to Jewish concerns, and the public is indifferent, shading on somewhat hostile, or at least portions of the public. Again, what I'm describing is a situation in which Jews are in Europe acted upon, where they're dependent on other larger forces, and that's what makes the European Jewish communities, to me, fundamentally different than both Israel, for obvious reasons, where Jews are deciding their own political fate, sometimes very badly, but that's another panel. And in America, where Jews have a kind of full acceptance in society and a kind of muscularity in their approach to issues, and a broad acceptance on the part of the political of the political elite and the general public, that Jews have as much right as any other minority group in America to assert itself, and so there's some autonomy there and some sort of independence, and so I'm veering far from your Hungary question, but I assume, because again, I'm a pessimist, that we will see that situation. And this fascinating question, which we didn't get at, which is what is more immediately dangerous to the Jews of Europe? Traditional classical, I think you called it, classical anti-Semitism of the old European fascist model, or Islamism? And just because the physical acts of terror are emanating from that certain corners of the Muslim world right now, doesn't mean that will always be the case. I don't have a huge amount of faith that parts of that classical anti-Semitic camp that those feelings have entirely dissipated.
Fantastic. Well, it's time. Whoa, we're going to have a good conversation. I should warn our panelists. CSIS audiences ask great and tough questions. So what we're going to do, if it's all right with the panel, I'm going to bundle a few questions. So if everyone could please identify yourself with your name and your organization, and just keep your questions very short, because we have so many hands, I want to get to all of them. So, Caius, I think we'll start down in the middle. I see two right here. So good to see you.
Michael Lee, a German Marshall Fund. Very briefly, as a European Jew and a former EU official, I must say that I think the overall picture of the climate in Europe given by Mr. Goldberg is seriously misleading. He indicates that but for certain governments, there's very little resistance to anti-Semitism. The ones he cited were not the least, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. He praised the leaders of all three. I might add that most new member states, in particular the Czech Republic, but also Bulgaria and Poland, have been strong supporters of Israel and opposed to anti-Semitism. Greece, which was not traditionally particularly close to Israel or to the Jewish people, has a new alignment with Cyprus and with Israel over energy and a lot of other issues. The decline of European Jews is mainly a matter of demography. And one of the main sources of the decline is intermarriage, a phenomenon one finds in the United States as well, in no way attributable to anti-Semitism, but rather just the population dynamics of an open society. I could go on, but I think it's very important to redress the overall balance.
Thank you for your comment. Can you just pass the microphone up there? Yeah, thank you.
Meto Koloski with the United Macedonian Diaspora, and I'd love to pose the sort of same hypothetical that Heather Conley posed in relations with an anti-Semitic, sort of xenophobic and anti-migrant party, Golden Dawn, which the elections in Greece are happening this weekend, and it's a very serious threat. Obviously, this party is third in parliament. They are third in the polls, and so what would happen if this party gains even more? And so what do we need to do, America, the European partners, given that Greece is a EU, NATO member state?
Thank you. I think there was one more. We'll take one more on the side right behind you, Caius. Thank you. And then we'll let the panelists in.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, United States Foreign Service retired. I'd like to ask about the two different streams of anti-Semitism that were mentioned, the old-fashioned neo-fascist, neo-Nazi anti-Semitism, and the Islamist type of anti-Semitism. Considering that the old-fashioned anti-Semitism also has xenophobic, anti-Muslim sentiment within it, and also the Islamist version of anti-Semitism also has anti-Western elements in it in favor of Sharia, anti-democracy. Nevertheless, will these streams continue to run separately, or do they share enough anti-Semitic values in common that despite those differences, they will forge, if not alliances, somehow work together through linkages, whether internet sub-organizations, somehow to strengthen their effects rather than run independently of each other?
Thank you so much. Let me let our panelists respond. Jeffrey, do you want to start? Your pessimism is being questioned.
That's fine. That's fine. I would reiterate only that a lot of these governments have done very good jobs of fighting anti-Semitism. I obviously acknowledged at the outset that the problem is partially demographic, and then even without anti-Semitism, we would see a European Jewry in demographic decline. I would point out that on the question of Greece, a recent survey by the ADL found that 69% of Greek citizens hold anti-Semitic views. You could find that on the web, obviously, and there are many surveys to show that Greece actually has anti-Semitic feeling among the populace on the level of Saudi Arabia. I don't know how to answer that question, except I will answer it anecdotally, that it depends in part on where you live. Now, I've gotten into an argument with a leader of the Polish Jewish community who said that everything's fine here because we don't have Muslim terrorism. And I said, sure, everything is absolutely fine, except that in the over the last 80 years, the Jewish population of Poland has dropped from 3 million to 30,000. So the trend lines aren't good. And that's why I keep talking about this as an epilogue period in the history of European Jewry, which does not mean that many Jews in Europe are finding ways to fully express their Judaism, that there's interesting Jewish educational and liturgical innovations going on in small and not so small Jewish communities. But I think it's easily defensible to say that the balance of power or the demographic weight within the world Jewry has shifted permanently away from Europe. And again, let me just come back to this point about just an anecdotal point. If you spend a lot of time in Toulouse, for instance, where I spent, or Malmo, or Copenhagen for that matter, you do find, unlike Warsaw, let's say, or even Rome, you do find Jewish communities that feel completely under siege. And that are teetering, with the loss of 6 or 8 or 10 crucial Jewish leaders in each community, those communities could collapse on themselves. And that is because they physically fear for their lives. And I don't see any point in downplaying that. And again, it's not me who's saying it, it's the leaders of these Jewish communities.
Jessica, it's a great question. Do you have counterparts in other EU capitals that sort of have that? Well, you call it interministerial, we call it interagency. But do you have counterparts in other capitals? Do you work together to strengthen government policy and action, share best practices? Is any of that going on?
Yes, but not with exactly the same positioning or the same scope. There is a High Commissioner in Germany appointed by the Ministry of Home Affairs, of Foreign Affairs, sorry, which is quite a different view, and he's focused on anti-Semitism only, if I may say, whereas the approach in France is to consider all the spectrum of xenophobia.
Is there a particular model that you see in OSCE capitals, or do you find an emerging practice of how governments tackle this question?
Well, let me first say to the comment before, look, we're sort of grouping together, so the future of Jewish life in Europe or anti-Semitism in Europe. I mean, obviously, Europe is not a single body. And I spent so much of my time, particularly through the 90s, in working with Jewish communities in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. For the most part, it's a wonderful story of the revival of Jewish life. Now, look, Europe was the capital, European Jewry was the capital of world Jewry before the Holocaust. That's never going to come back. We know that. And I will find, say, if I spend time in Vilnius or I spend time in Warsaw, for that matter, in Budapest, I can never know what this was like before the Holocaust. But the reality is today that one would not have predicted through the 1980s that Jewish life would return. And one other point I think to keep in mind, today, because we're so interconnected, not just virtually, electronically, but physically it's so easy to move around, the critical mass of what can enable a Jewish community to survive may be different today than it was 2 generations ago. I mean, admittedly, it may be a small community in Poland or it's a small community in Estonia, but most of those Jewish kids who are growing up there have been to Israel. They move around. Teachers can come. We can import kosher meats. In fact, we have to in some of these Scandinavian countries because they want to ban ritual slaughter, which is another subject. But again, I think it's such a variety in terms of the way Jewish life can express itself. Yes, you can have growth and positive developments, and probably, again, Hungary has the largest Jewish community in Central Europe, so there's so much that's positive there. At the same time, the political environment has become so complicated and so difficult, and the more, I think, Jewishly expressive people are, the more they run into these essential contradictions. Someone mentioned Greece. I mean, the reality is the Jewish community in Greece hasn't been a target because people can't find them. I mean, it's such a small community, and it's largely an assimilated community. So it says it numbers 5,000 because in order to be an official minority, it has to have 5,000 members. It may not even have that. That doesn't mean, and again, it's another case, you can have anti-Semitism without Jews. That's another weird reality of the world today. I don't know how you can...
It makes it easier, actually.
Yeah, well...
Yeah.
I found at one point when I was in Spain, there was a survey done by the education ministry that found that 50% of Spanish adolescents or teenagers said they didn't want to sit next to a Jewish student in school. Now, the challenge would be if they wanted to, because there are so few Jews in Spain, they just wouldn't be possible.
It's been a problem since 1492.
Yes. But they're welcome back now, as we've seen. So, see, we might come back 10 years from now, and Spanish Jewry will now be resurgent. I don't know. But again, I think at least the OSCE has been a vehicle to try to focus on this issue, to try to get, we had at least a statement, ministerial level statement last December after what was going to be an anniversary conference that was itself difficult to maneuver. In a way, because of the events last summer, it made it, I think, more compelling. But so it was possible with all the craziness to at least have a statement reasserting some of the issues that had been raised, committing governments. Again, it's easy for them to make commitments. Living up to them is another question, but it was at least part of the declaration and documents that came out of the OSCE last year.
Andy, I have a great idea. As Germany takes over the chairmanship in office next year, perhaps we could have a bigger expression from the OSCE or something much more purposeful from Germany. That could be an idea.
By the way, just to say, because I was last week in Berlin meeting, the Germans, after all, are Germans, so they're already planning for their chairmanship, which doesn't begin until January. And one of my experience has been, well, okay, you have the mantle of taking up combating anti-Semitism, and you have different governments saying, well, that's fine, but we shouldn't be doing too much against one discriminatory act. We have to do it against others. In other words, there shouldn't be a hierarchy of victims. And these are Western European governments, frankly, that say this. So you begin to feel, yes, we can do something, but be careful you don't do too much without doing it here and here and here. And one of the German officials who's working on their chairmanship next year said, well, because we're German, other countries are going to expect it of us, so we can do it. So see, maybe we do have something to look forward to.
Andy, I love you balance the positive and the negative. I love that about you. I think we have a couple questions here down in the front. Do you want to, whoever, I've got a microphone faster. Coming your way.
Thank you. Irv Chapman by name. I work for Bloomberg. I'd like to, we've heard a lot about the need to protect Jewish institutions from extremists of various sorts, principally Muslim, but not entirely. But in terms of anti-Semitism getting worse in Western Europe, to what extent does that show itself in terms of discrimination against Jews increasing in the workplace, in universities, in public institutions, and patronage of their businesses? And also, to what extent has anti-Semitism increased as the Israeli body politic has turned to the right?
Excellent. I think we had a question right over here, guys. Right there.
Yes, thank you. My name is Mindy Reiser. For many years, I was on the Board of Trustees of American Jewish World Service, which works all over the world in development. My question is a country in the neighborhood. It's called Russia. It's not Europe, but maybe parts of it are. And I'm wondering how what we're seeing in Europe impacts on Russian Jewry and how you see their future. There are nationalist forces in that country that do not think well of Jews, but on the other hand, Vladimir Putin seems to think very well, at least of certain categories of Jews. And of course, we have a Jewish community in Ukraine. So these areas have some implication for the future of the Jewish community in Europe and near Europe. I'd like some comments.
Terrific question. Let's see if they have any more on this side, since we haven't hit this. What, sir, right back there? And then we'll come back to it.
Bob Kopekin, this sort of relates to what the previous question was asked about the impact on businesses. The BDS movement, boycott, sanction, divest, how is that able to be combated? Because it purports to be relating just to Israel and their treatment of Palestinians, but it really has a delegitimizing function as far as Jews are concerned.
three great questions. I think on the Russia point, it's so interesting that the Kremlin is funding a lot of far-right parties like Front National and others, so there's a Russia connection. And I know, Jeffrey, you have actually written about the impact of boycotting of products, and you had a recent article on the UK that was of interest. So who'd like to begin?
I'm just reading the Twitter feed about this session, by the way. It's okay so far.
Oh, good.
It's been reasonably accurate depiction.
Now that is real-time social media, my friends.
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
No. Why don't Andy start? I don't have anything to add on the BDS.
Well, let me comment on Russia and Ukraine. By the way, I think this is a case, Jeffrey mentioned in some Western European countries, it sort of looks like the sort of old medieval model. It's sort of what the ruler does and allow and provide protection. I think if you talk to Jewish community leaders in Russia, they would say Putin is really the significant force right now in keeping anti-Semitism, which I think they think it's still out there, but keeping it from really emerging. I know one Russian Jewish leader saying, periodically you'll find in the Russian media and in newspaper and television a kind of anti-Semitic screed. And they really wait and see if the government's going to tamp down on that. And so far they have. But they're saying, well, what will happen after Putin? Because I think there is the sense that there are a lot of other people around there that might jump in on this. So ironically, they would tell you in terms of day-to-day life, they're probably more at ease than you'd find in most of Western Europe, but I don't think they feel it's guaranteed. And there is this discomfort, there is this irony in the Russia-Ukraine conflict that, in a way, who's more anti-Semitic is the charge that's being leveled sort of one to the other, or the Jews become sort of instrumentalized in this. And if you talk to Ukrainian Jews, Ukraine is not without problems, but they sort of feel from the Maidan demonstrations and coming forward that the more right-wing and extremist parties have tended to be marginalized. They have a more positive view of Ukrainian society, but there are a lot of attacks coming from the Russian media that sort of elevate the historic role of these groups in Western Ukraine. I think there are also Ukrainian Jewish leaders who in some ways downplay the significance of that, because we've seen how difficult it has been in other parts of Eastern Europe for countries to come to terms with their Holocaust-era past, which is also something that has contributed to anti-Semitism. And Ukraine really has a long way to go to even begin to confront this. So it's a particular, I think, situation all its own, really, in Russia and Ukraine. But again, they're significantly sized, at least in this post-Holocaust, post-war period, significantly sized Jewish communities, so they do matter.
Jeff, do you want to I would love for you to talk a little bit about the impact of the boycotting of Israeli goods, how that has sort of manifested itself. And then Jules, I'd love your comment if you are seeing trend lines in the increased discrimination of businesses, universities, schools, if you're seeing that in any manifestation in Paris or in other European context.
I mean, look, this is a difficult needle to thread, obviously, because there has to be room and space in this city, in Europe, for legitimate policy criticism of policies of the Israeli government. What you see particularly last summer was what you didn't see were demonstrations outside Israeli embassies yelling down with the occupation or stop the war on Gaza. You heard, even in Berlin, you heard chants like Hamas, Hamas, Jews to the gas, and you saw swastikas being drawn in the middle of Paris, and you saw all sorts of, and obviously the sacking of synagogues. If your first impulse upon being angered by something Israel does is to burn down a synagogue, you're not doing it right. And so, this is where the line bleeds over. There's a separate discussion to be had, and it's a complicated one, about why you can gin up a demonstration of 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 people against Israel this is not to disparage the size and the calamitous nature of the Gaza war last year, but you can't get 500 people to a demonstration to protest the Syrian civil war, which has now taken upwards of 300,000 lives? I mean, there is this interesting question. You know, there's a lot of theories about this. You know, one of the theories, obviously, is that Europe remains innately anti-Semitic and is innately going to hold Jews, it manifested themselves as a state, to a higher double standard. I mean, there's that old saw about, you know, Europe will never forgive Jews for the Holocaust. To be reminded of the Holocaust constantly is a burden for them. There's obviously quotidian politics involved in this when you have large voting blocks that are Muslim and small voting blocks that are Jewish. Obviously, politicians will lean in a certain direction because that's the nature of politics. I don't know if there's a single point answer to why the narrative in Europe is so much more unbalanced than it is here. I mean, which is not to say that there's not plenty of pro-Palestinian sentiment in this country, but why it is so lopsided and why it so quickly veers into this sort of stereotyping that means that it's not about the occupation, it's about something else entirely. Except, and again, to play the role of the pessimist, anti-Semitism in Europe should be one of the least surprising phenomenon in global affairs today. I mean, we should not be surprised that Jews are held to a higher, different, double, hypocritical, whatever you want to call it, standard, because it is not entirely clear to a lot of people that Europe has expunged its patterns of anti-Semitic narratives and patterns of anti-Semitic thought.
Well, as far as moves towards discrimination of Jew businesses or Jew people, there's no issue about that. I mean, there is nothing getting into that direction, fortunately, at least. Just to moderate a little bit, or to put things in perspective. The mobilizations for Palestine in July last year gathered at the climax of them something like 18,000 people. That's of course much more than the would-be counter-mobilization to support Israel or to mourn the victims of some attacks prior to the ones of January. That's right. But as to compare to a 4 million population of Muslim peoples, that must be said and put into perspective. And I must add that among these 18,000 people, of course, they were not all heading to the synagogue to try to sack it. So let's just put it. But still, what is true, and I fully agree with that, and what Jeffrey said is that 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, it was still possible to have a reasonable and somewhat sane criticism of the politics of Israel that was not as far right as it is today, but it was criticized. And first and foremost by the French Jewish community, which was very, very, in the good sense of the word, very critical against Israel governments. It has been too complex, too touchy, too sensitive too tight a question to address now, and the ability to put the things quietly, to discuss and to address this issue in a reasonable manner has totally disappeared. And that's one of the greatest loss, not especially on the Israel issue actually, but to be able to talk about these complex situation, both in global and domestic, in quite a specific and reasoned way, has almost vanished, and that's a big problem. And of course, the way to speak rationally of Israel is really something very difficult today, if not among academics, and again, even among academics, it's very difficult today. One word maybe on the BDS movement, because behaviors in France, I don't know in other countries, but in France, no, I know about other countries, but especially in France, are not completely homogeneous. Because probably BDS is quite a smart, and in the perverse sense of the word, a smart way to protest. It looks cool. Boycotting products, in fact, has been quite a apparently pacific way to defend your cause. Of course, when we come to know what the real agenda of the BDS supporters is, we shouldn't be any tolerant. And to that extent, the French law is very clear, and there have been some instructions given to the prefects, local bodies in France, to file complaints each time there would be boycott movements and such protests as in the supermarkets and things like that. And we have some virulent spots of BDS in the south, especially in Montpellier, in Toulouse, places where, especially Montpellier, places where the Front National also is thriving and has the opportunity to take advantage of the very virulent pro-Muslim, pro-Palestine, pro-Arabic moves of the BDS to say that's the fear we're facing, and we are the strongest guy to fight against that. But on the other hand, I must say that even among the Jewish representatives, there is no consensus upon what we should do and the way we should act against it. Some of these voices, and I must say I'm a bit troubled by that because it's a smart view, say beware of the fact that it might happen to appear as popular, cool, and a non-violent way to protest.
Fascinating. I know we did not get to all the hands. I'm so sorry. We're running out of time, but I hope the panelists will stay for a few moments to allow for conversation. I'm so sorry. We're out of time, but thank you to all three of you. It has been an extraordinary conversation, one that we need to continue. We have pessimism, we have optimism, we have a government trying to address the challenges, but thank you all for joining us, and please join me in thanking our three panelists for a great presentation.
Thank you.